What's up, guys? Just a little quick disclaimer here. This video was on my channel just a couple of months ago before, at least in my opinion, it was unfairly given a strike for my entire channel. Just this one video, one picture, manipulated picture for the Saw franchise. Someone struck it without even copywriting it or anything. I didn't want to go through the hassle of debating it or anything else like that, so I waited for that to go away. I'm going to redo the video itself, so if you watched it, you can watch it again. If you didn't watch it, it's here for your viewing pleasure now. Hope everyone enjoys. What's up, guys? Today we're going to be talking about Spiral from the Book of Saw. And at least at the time of recording this video, we are about a little less than 4 months removed from the release of this movie. We have it on DVD, we have it on Blu-ray, we have it on 4K. You know, if you haven't rented the movie, you haven't had any chance to watch it. Heck, if you go and you just pirate movies, if that's how you watch stuff like this and you don't want to support it with, you know, your financial gain or anything, that's fine. I don't care at all. I mean, it kind of undercuts the idea that you're going to get more of it, but you know, these days nothing really seems to die, so that's totally fine by me. I don't care. I don't profit off of them making more of these or anything. I'm just a fan who really likes to talk about it. Just what I'm going to say. Anyway, getting back to Spiral itself, because that's what this video is really about. I've already talked about this in my review. I've talked about this in other videos, and I wanted to do my best to reiterate and just kind of go over my thoughts yet again, in that I am not happy with how this movie turned out. So much so that it has kind of made it a little less fun to think about and talk about this franchise. And one of the reasons I'm making this video is because I'm trying to get a sense of how many people just agree with me or how many people think I am way overthinking this, because that in and of itself is a huge possibility. I have spent not an insignificant amount of time covering Saw-related content on this channel in the past, as well as on my other channels in the past, going through the House of Jigsaw forums and just talking with people, pitching ideas for stuff, just the works, right? I am what most people would consider a mega fan of this franchise, even though, you know, there's no reason of trying to be the best at anything, especially since you get into internet cultures and you realize that there are people who love it way more than me, who watch those movies on repeat when I haven't done a thorough rewatching of the entire series for, man, at least a couple of years now. I've been meaning to, but, you know, ever since this movie really dropped, it is kind of hit me. I don't know anymore. I mean, I would like a 10th film, but I think it would really need a huge course correction. And that's something I want to talk about later, along with a couple of other things. I will probably end up making multiple videos discussing these things separately, but I wanted to put it all in one video and get the community response for this, because anything and everything I talk about here is subject, I think, to a more in-depth video that's not as rambly. And if you want to share your thoughts on one thing or another, then please do share it in the comment section, because I would really like to read it, respond to it, and maybe even do a video where I call out your comment in particular and talk about it on its merits. You know, the first thing that really comes to mind when it comes to my apprehension to this film, what it means to the legacy of the franchise, and where I think that we're going from here, is the amount of money that it made, despite however it tried to sell itself as a brand new thing with star power to boot. Spiral from the Book of Saw made $23 million domestically, $15 million internationally, for less than $40 million, $38 million worldwide. It is the lowest grossing Saw movie to date. And I guess there is some reliance that, yes, it was part of the pandemic, and people weren't going out to see movies in general as much as they really would. This is the 9th film in a franchise. It doesn't have the same pulling power, and it wasn't even sold under its name. Like, there was just a lot going against it. And I feel like that's all worth talking about. But when you're looking at what they did for this movie, the amount of talent they brought in, and what they decided to do with the story, how much they wanted to spend, it just seems in retrospect like a terrible idea. And the reason I feel even the slightest bit of indication there is I feel like I was talking about this ever since I read about it, that it just felt like a terrible idea. Even though a lot of people were giving Chris Rock and the creative team the benefit of the doubt. The fact that comedians have come out as of late and been making fantastic, successful horror movies over the last, half decade, maybe that this would be good enough to kind of justify its own existence. I have to admit I bought into that a little bit as well, and I started getting more and more into the hype train, especially as the pandemic pushed everything off and we had to wait an additional year to get this movie when we thought we were getting it in just a couple of months before they pushed it. So I get that. I also get that, despite the vaccine, despite everything else, this movie performed poorly because we're in a very volatile situation. And try as they might, a horror movie starring Samuel L. Jackson and Chris Rock is not going to pull in the exact same numbers as a brand new horror franchise in The Quiet Place Part 2 that's coming off of rave reviews from the second one and pretty much being the first event film coming off of the vaccine being widely distributed in the United States. Totally makes sense there, especially since, like Spiral, A Quiet Place Part 2 was a film that was theater only. On that same token, the Conjuring franchise is $2 billion franchise. The Forever Purge was coming off of its most successful film in its entire franchise. It also spent way more money than it probably should have and did not gross anywhere near as much. But I do think that movie was genuinely likable. And it was also coming off of 2 seasons worth of television that were also fairly good. I mean, that franchise as a whole is somewhat fairly consistent. I'm not looking for grand art, but I have enjoyed everything else that they put out thus far. Escape Room 2 is a movie that I have not seen at the time of recording this video, but I do really want to see. I liked the first one well enough. I had a little bit of reservations going into this one, ones that I don't think are alleviated based off of everything that I've seen or even heard from. Haven't heard a whole lot from it in general, but at the same time I am fairly excited to see that one. Can't wait for it to be on Blu-ray. Would love to be able to rent it beforehand for a considerably nicer price than $20. We're just going to have to wait and see on that, and I'll get back to you with my thoughts. Not to mention the planted stories from Lionsgate and Twisted Pictures, with the prospect of a 10th film already being in development before the release of Spiral itself. The reason I say planted there is because we all know that was a strategically based story for people to start talking about the movie before it hits theaters, as a way of showing enthusiasm and excitement for a potential sequel for this film or just a continuation of the franchise as a whole, without even a commitment to do that movie whether or not this film was a success or not. Seriously, it is very important to know just how cynical Hollywood could be sometimes, even if that is reporting on a sequel in development before the first one comes out with no intention of even doing it, or better yet, announcing a sequel that never happens because they were just trying to build up promotion for a film that they wanted to show the perception of success for. The reason I think the latter of those two is more interesting than the former is the former is way more common than the latter, and it doesn't seem like Lionsgate or Twisted Pictures have taken full advantage of the COVID curve by putting out more fake articles and quote-unquote announcing the fact that they're going to do a continuation for Saw sometime in the near future because this movie outperformed despite everything going on. And I'm not even joking there. This is something that we've literally seen for the last couple of months as films are taking distinct advantage of the COVID curve, with The Quiet Place Part 2 leading into an announcement of a spin-off film, Cruella 2 being announced immediately despite its divisive success on Disney Plus and also in theaters. There's also the fact that Disney now wants to make a Jungle Cruise 2 despite that movie not doing as well as they might have otherwise hoped. For what it's worth, I do think a lot of studios are looking at this right now and thinking, we can parlay this film's success and longevity into a sequel that a lot of people will find later and be able to go back into what was made before and enjoy that through a more sustainable income stream, something like a streaming service or anything else. Unfortunately, I'm not seeing any of that from Lionsgate or Twisted Pictures when it comes to the Saw franchise, and I think it would benefit them to at least talk about it going forward and not just as the movie itself was releasing. Finally, as I've argued on this channel time and time again, opening up a Saw movie in May, of all other places, was always a terrible idea, and one that Lionsgate should have realized based off their failure with the Hostel franchise, as they released the sequel to that in May to abysmal numbers and thus killing the franchise altogether. I don't understand, with everything else that's going on, why they would stick to that date because of some arbitrary success that they found with John Wick 2. A fairly popular franchise of a completely different genre and nothing in relation to what they had in this movie. If anything, that is the most annoying part of this entire discussion. The fact that Lionsgate crippled their own franchise, not by accident, but almost willingly so. Now, one of the things that we did hear, given that pretty much everything is said and done in terms of box office, we don't have the various numbers for the VODs or the Blu-rays as of yet, but we did have word from the producers that they were going to be sitting down sometime late summer, early fall, and start talking about the prospects for the future of the series, based off of the success of Spiral. And luckily, this does include the pitch for the movie they had in mind before they ended up doing Spiral, something that's seemingly deeply rooted in the lore of the Saw franchise, a prequel film instead of a direct continuation from Jigsaw or anything that came after Saw 3D. And that is what ultimately leads me to the fact that no matter when these talks occur, we're not going to be getting a Saw film for a while, unless they figure out that they have to do this prequel film because Tobin Bell literally is not getting any younger. They need him for at least one more movie. It's the 10th movie in the franchise, something to sell as his last film, while also doing your best to create a cheap legacy prequel movie that the fans will then show up for. Because it's clear that people are not showing up for a new take on the franchise as a whole, even with big stars. With that being said, because this is already going a little bit long, I want to talk briefly about Josh Stolberg and Pete Goldfinger and their contribution to the franchise as a whole. This is something I've been wanting to talk about for months, and as I already said, I probably will already do another video dedicated to this because I feel like we're so far into this video right now that a lot of people are just going to be jumping ship. But one of the more general criticisms I've seen of these two creators from the comment section or just the community as a whole is that they are not good for the franchise and they need to be replaced immediately. The reason I think that won't happen, at least immediately, for this next film, the 10th film in the franchise, is because based off of all the interviews that I was reading up until the release of Spiral and generally after the release, is because the people who are involved with this franchise seem to have somewhat of a passion for the story that Josh and Pete created before they had to do Spiral. I don't know what that means, and there's no indication of whether or not they're going to end up doing that movie and just paying Josh and Pete off for the story rights without really having them write the script. But I would wonder if there was some kind of deal or understanding that if Spiral was made before this movie, that Pete and Josh would be able to come back and make the movie that they wanted to sometime down the line. Now, with that being said, here's the reason why I don't want them to leave, at least not for the very next film. When it comes to the franchise as a whole, I feel like we put way too much weight in the first 3 films, when the main writer was the creator of the franchise himself, Leigh Whannell. Obviously, Leigh Whannell had a fantastic understanding of the characters and the world in which this franchise took place in, with pretty much every single story he decided to tell being a little bit more interconnected while also being somewhat of a standalone adventure. This would lead to what I would consider a perfect trilogy of horror movies in what would have gone down in history as one of the best horror franchises of all time had they just stopped with the third one. But as we all know, they didn't. They brought in Marcus Dunstan and Patrick Melton to finish off the last couple of films in the franchise, at least up until that point. And while those films did have their ups and downs, it is important to note that unlike Pete and Josh, they were allowed to weave in the story between multiple films and end up, at least in retrospect, giving a lot more weight to their entries in the series, more than they would have been if they had just been thrown out at the very beginning. Seriously, say what you want about Saw 4 and Saw 5, but once Saw 6 comes around and wraps in everything that happened from Saw 3 onward, you have a little bit of a different perspective for those movies going forward. Even if individually they might not be your favorites, as a whole, it works, and it's one of the best things about the Saw franchise. However, taking that at its most basic, Josh and Pete have not been able to do that. And that's not saying they didn't drop the ball with Jigsaw. That's not saying they don't deserve some of the blame with dropping the ball so hard with Spiral. What it is saying is they have not been given the opportunity that we kind of gave all the other people who worked on these movies after Lee Winnell and James Wan had jumped ship. And I do understand that times are different. The Saw franchise is not as strong as it used to be, and every single time it puts another series at the plate, it needs to have a home run. But when you're dealing with a series like Saw that's so interconnected, as well as also commercially viable, you start running into a lot of problems. It's not your typical horror movie franchise where you can bring back John because of some dark witch magic, and its interconnectivity allows you to create something genuinely interesting as well as the dumbest things possible. For what it's worth, I do like Jigsaw, and I feel like if they had been given another opportunity to continue that story with those characters, at least for another film or even two, by the time we got to the end, saw everything connect, and gotten a chance to breathe with this new story, it would have come together in a similar way that Saw 6 did from its previous two movies. But that's not what happened. They've been forced to tell two very different stories with no interconnection between them over the last two films that they got. And that is somewhat of an unfair comparison, especially when you're comparing it to other films in the franchise. Heck, when you're comparing it to pretty much any other horror movie franchise that you can think of that has relied so heavily on its story. Or anything. Maybe I'm wrong there, but you tell me in the comments section if you hate that perspective. I just think we should give them more of the benefit of the doubt. Finally, because this video has gone on way longer than I've wanted it to, I don't know what it's going to end up being in terms of runtime, but I've been talking here for about 45 minutes. I just want to reiterate the fact that Spiral has kind of broken me in terms of being a Saw fan. I will still do Sawtober. I'm still really looking forward to it. If we start hearing that there's going to be a 10th film, I'm going to get excited again because genuinely I'm just a big fan of this franchise and I want the best for it. But Spiral was not the best for it. I don't think that there was any passion from anybody who was really creatively behind it other than maybe Chris Rock. And I'm not saying people didn't bring their A game and try the best they could, but uprooting the story that you wanted to tell and something you thought fans would genuinely be excited about, and maybe even newer fans would come back and be like, okay, yeah, this is just, this is Saw, but it has Tobin Bell as a prominent feature because it's a prequel or whatever, and it's upfront about that at the very beginning. I think that would have been a smarter play than doing something completely different that ended up not being as different as they wanted to. Like, if you were going to come in, bring in star power, tell a completely different story, then don't do cops, don't do procedural elements, don't do anything. Try to tell a better story, because what they gave us here is lazy. And I got the movie on 4K because obviously I'm a huge fan. I said I was, and I watched it. I watched it again for the fourth time. I watched it with the director's commentary. I really had a hard time getting through the director's commentary, I have to tell you. And I haven't even sat down to listen to the producer's commentary because pretty much everybody I know who's done it says it's the most boring, half-assed commentary they've ever listened to. And that's how I felt about the director's commentary. There's nothing there. There's nothing that I really wanted, anticipated. It's just, okay, this is how we did this shot. This is what we did. This was going on on the set and all this other stuff. But when you go back and you listen to some of the commentaries from the series in the past, especially Saw 3, there is so much love, appreciation, respect, not only for the series, but for the fans as a whole, as they talk about the story, how it connects, and why the audience really gravitates towards it. It's not about the traps. It's not about anything else. It's these characters, this situation, this world, and how it interconnects and just cycles around John Kramer and his crazy, maniacal plans. That's what we love. And that's not what Spiral gave us. It had essentially no connection at all, not even a really good one to tie everything together, and it did the same old tired thing over and over and over again, just with a new coat of paint. And that's why just typically it broke me. This series is a little bit broken to me right now. Again, they come out with the 10th film, they start hyping it up, it's going to be something completely different, or maybe even a sequel to this. I'm interested enough to see what they do with it. I just don't think you really can do anything with it. But if they do, that's fine. I will talk about it. I'm going to be hoping for the best of it because I'm a fan. I can be critical while also loving the thing that I put a lot of time, energy, and thought into. Anyway, guys, this video has been way too long as it is. Hope everyone is doing fantastic, staying safe and healthy. It's been real.